anything that fate throws at us, any setback or misfortune, as long as we know how to take it in the right way, it can be beneficial. It's like Nietzsche saying, "What does not kill me can only make me stronger."
Donald, we are so happy to have you back to the show again. The previous interview with you always gives me new perspectives. Every time I see that interview, it really helped me and other people a lot. I'm so happy to welcome you back to the show, Donald. Thanks for coming to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to it. And, it's a great privilege to be able to tell people about Stoicism, because every day I hear from people that say that they find it inspiring and helpful. So I just have a great time chatting about it. It's my hobby.
And that's a pretty good hobby. Thank you.
Yeah, pretty cool hobby.
Yeah, cool hobby. So before we go into the questions, can you tell us about your new book, Verismas, Donald?
Yes. It's a graphic novel.
Yes.
So it's kind of like a comic book for adults. And it's the story of Marcus Aurelius and his life as emperor. But as I was writing it, I kind of thought it's a little bit like a prequel to Gladiator in a way. Marcus Aurelius is played by Richard Harris at the beginning of the Ridley Scott movie Gladiator, and he dies near the start of the movie. So it's an epic sword and sandals story, but there's a lot more philosophy in it. We focused a lot on how Stoicism influenced him and his progress through learning about Stoicism and his whole life story. A lot of people, I find, assume that we don't really know much about Marcus Aurelius, but actually we probably know more about him than about perhaps any other ancient Greek or Roman philosopher. Because he was an emperor, we have many writings about him. We have several biographies of his life. There are lots of references and other writings to him. We have a cache of his letters. We have inscriptions and statues. So we know quite a lot about him.
Yes, Donald, and he's my favorite Stoic. I think there's too many people as well. So, Donald, my first question is, how should one give advice according to Seneca?
How should one give advice? I think for the Stoics, actually, they're fairly clear that, ironically, because they're all dead, so we only have their writings now, and they would think that's a little bit odd, because the Stoics thought that philosophy as a way of life should mainly be learned from role models, from real people. And that's partly why I chose to write about Marcus Aurelius, because I thought we write books kind of lecturing people on Stoicism, but the Stoics thought it was mainly by looking at living human beings. So I thought we should write about a historical figure and how they actually applied it in practice. So the Stoics thought we should try to set an example to people. We should lead by example, like very much. And beyond that, in terms of giving advice, they thought that, unlike the Cynic philosophers, who were known for their freedom of speech, or paresia in Greek, the Stoics agreed with that. They thought we should try to speak the truth, but they thought it also needs to be adapted so that people can benefit from it. There's a famous story about Diogenes the Cynic, and Alexander the Great came to see him one day, the most powerful man in the world, and he said that Diogenes lived like a beggar. He was naked, almost a bit like a Hindu, like holy man, like a sannyasin. He went about naked. He didn't own any property. He lived outside the city walls in a barrel, and Alexander, who had everything, allegedly, according to this story, which may not be historically true, but it says, Alexander says, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" And Diogenes just said, "Yeah, could you step aside? You're blocking the sun." He didn't really need anything from him. But the Stoics would say, although he made an interesting point there, Alexander didn't really benefit from it. He just went back to trying to conquer the world and accumulate wealth and glory and stuff. And so the Stoics would say we should speak the truth to people, and we should challenge them, but we should also do it in a way that they're going to be receptive to. So they believed, to some extent, in tact, and in using language more effectively, in a way that people can actually understand. And sometimes, for example, Epictetus says the Stoics feel that we should transcend certain aspects of grief or suffering. But Epictetus says sometimes, look, if someone is grieving, you should grieve along with them, because they're not going to be ready to hear you saying things like it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. He said, as long as you don't join them in their grief inwardly, like we have to adapt to what people are going to be ready to hear. So I think that's partly how the Stoics think we should give advice. We should be careful. It would be narcissistic to just give advice in a way that we ourselves would benefit from, rather than thinking, how it needs to be phrased for the other person.
It's Donald. And Seneca, I have read this in your book that Seneca said that we should give advice in such a way that we are in a hospital trying to.
Yes.
Yeah, can you share about that?
So I believe that we don't know, I'm speculating, but I think this might go all the way back to the origins of Stoicism. So most other Greek philosophies are named after their founder. So Pythagoreanism is named after Pythagoras. Epicureanism is named after Epicurus. We talk about Platonism and Aristotelianism after the founders. But Stoicism isn't called Zenonism after its founder. Apparently it was very briefly, and then they abandoned it, and they called it after the Stoa Poikile, the public building where they used to meet. And I think in part they did that because the Stoics were known for claiming that their founder wasn't perfectly wise. So they didn't put him on a pedestal and make him into a kind of guru. He acknowledged that he was flawed and imperfect, and so did all of the Stoic teachers. I think in this they were influenced by Socrates, who also made a point of emphasizing that he was just a student asking questions. He didn't claim to be perfectly wise. And Seneca says that the way that he gives advice is like a patient in the bed next to you in hospital, rather than being a doctor patient or an expert student relationship. It's more like peer support. It would be like Alcoholics Anonymous or a peer support group today. Actually, it sounds a lot like that's what he's describing, that kind of relationship, where he says, look, I've just been going through therapy for longer than you. So I don't claim to be an expert, but I can share my experience and tell you what's worked for me and what hasn't. And I kind of wonder whether that was what Zeno said originally. Perhaps he did, because there seems to have been this long-standing tradition of the Stoics wanting to say that they're not experts, they're not perfectly wise, but they're rather commenting on the progress that they've made so far. There's a kind of humility to Stoicism in that regard, and it prevents it from turning into a kind of personality cult.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Donald. Donald, I was explaining the concept of amor fati to a friend of mine. She said that
Yeah.
why should we suffer in the first place? Why can't we have good life without suffering and struggles?
Well, as the Buddhists say, life is suffering in a sense. At least there's pain and discomfort in life, just because of the way that our bodies are constructed and the way that life is. So we need to learn not to add an extra layer to our suffering by suffering in response to suffering. So in psychology and psychotherapy, this is quite important. When people become neurotic or when they develop psychiatric disorders, we now believe it's often because they're struggling against their base level of suffering, and so it's natural sometimes to feel sad, and we can feel sadness and learn from it and process it and move beyond it. It's just part of the tapestry of human life. But people who refuse to feel sad and try and block feelings of sadness, find them intolerable, often just end up making themselves clinically depressed. It's normal to feel anxious. If you're a celebrity or an actor or a performer and you get on stage, maybe you don't feel, some people don't feel any nerves anymore, but some people throughout their whole career feel a certain amount of anxiety when they get on stage in front of a big audience. It's a kind of adrenaline rush, and that's normal. But some people try to suppress or avoid those feelings. Maybe they use drugs to kind of mask them, or they just avoid getting into situations that might trigger them. And that becomes problematic. So it's not the pain or the discomfort of sadness or anxiety or physical pain that's a problem. It's what happens next. It's the way that we respond to it that's the real problem. And so the Stoics understood this, as did the Cynic philosophers, and they realized that a wise man or woman is going to need to be tolerant of pain, discomfort, anxiety, unpleasant feelings to a certain extent. Amor fati is a Latin phrase. It's a strange phrase because it's coined by Nietzsche, who was a classical philologist. He studied classics. And there's no instance, as far as I'm aware, of that Latin phrase being used in any extant classical text. So no one really knows where it came from. It looks like he just coined it himself. But it sounds really similar to passages, particularly in Marcus Aurelius. However, there is a Greek phrase that comes from you've probably heard know thyself and all things in moderation. These are sayings associated with the cult of the god Apollo in Delphi. They were engraved outside the temple to Apollo. But there are many maxims from Apollo that influenced Greek philosophy. And one of them is love your fate. I think it's sterge tike. My ancient Greek's pretty rusty, but it's something like that in ancient Greek, just two words. So that I don't know if that's where Nietzsche got it from, but there is a Greek phrase that means the same thing as amor fati. And so it may be, the Plutarch once said that the oracle in Delphi has these maxims. Most of them are only two words in Greek. And yet Plutarch, who was a Neoplatonist or Middle Platonist philosopher, and also he was a priest at Delphi, he said these short phrases are like seeds from which huge trees grow. And he said there are books many volumes long that have been written discussing what know thyself or all things in moderation mean. And so it's like this woman, the priestess, the Pythia, was planting these little seeds like a koan or something, inspiring philosophers throughout the centuries. And one of them was love your fate.
Thank you, Donald. So, Donald, what's your favorite Stoic word? Like we have been discussing so many words like amor fati and memento mori, etc. So, what's your favorite?
I have lots, really, and I don't know that I have a number one. But we were talking earlier about on my arm, I have tattooed in ancient Greek, "Uden denon peponthas," which is something that was said to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. So it's at the very origins of Stoicism. So Zeno had social anxiety or shyness, it seems, and his Cynic teacher, Crates of Thebes, told him to take a pot of lentil soup and walk through this district in Athens called the Keramikis, which is a cemetery, but also prostitutes worked there and potters worked there, and it was quite busy. So he was walking through this bustling area, sacred, but also kind of slightly rough area, with this pot, but he hid it under his cloak because he was embarrassed. People looking at him, I guess, like he was crazy. And Crates saw him and walked up and smashed the pot with his staff, and so the lentil soup trickled all down his clothes and down his legs. And Zeno was so embarrassed that he wanted to run away and hide. And Crates said, "But uden denon peponthas, nothing terrible has happened to you. Like, it's all in your head. Like, it's just lentil soup, right?" And to me, this is kind of, again, like a seed. It's at the very origin of Stoicism, this idea that we tend to catastrophize things which in themselves are not catastrophic, is one of the fundamental insights of all Stoic philosophy.
Yeah, Donald. Donald, I suddenly got this realization that many Stoics, like the founder Stoics, they know themselves that they are not perfect and they have their own faults.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the Stoicism would have become a religion by now.
Yeah, I think so. And, a good example of that, I suppose, would be in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He's quite self-critical at times. There's passages where he's really scathing. He says, he tells himself he's never really going to be a great thinker. He says that he sees himself as kind of having setbacks and failing in his moral progress. He mentions in passing that he struggled to control his temper at some point in his life. So if you look very closely, he comes across as quite a human character. He's not claiming to be a saint. He's a guy who struggles with desire, who struggles with temper, who has anxieties, like who gets down, and he's training himself to use stoicism to cope with that. Now, actually, just as an aside, I'll mention that people might find this useful. There are many mistakes that psychologists believe ordinary people make every day in terms of their self-help. There are tendencies people have to misuse self-help, and we're living in an era now, an era of self-help, where the internet is absolutely awash, more and more and more, it seems, every year, with more and more podcasts and articles about self-help advice. And I think cognitive behavioural therapists, evidence-based therapists, know that there are some dangers inherent in that. And one of them is that sometimes people use self-help strategies that are counterproductive or harmful, or not the best strategies. Now, one of them is role modeling. There are two main ways that we model or emulate behavior from other people, and psychologists call them mastery modeling and coping modeling. So mastery modeling would be where you look at somebody who's amazing at something and you try to copy them, like the world's greatest public speaker, and you think, I want to be like that guy one day. And coping modeling is where you look at people who are making a bit more progress than you are, who have similar obstacles to overcome that you do. But like Seneca said, they're kind of further along the path. And we know from research on modeling that generally people benefit more from coping modeling. And so I think I relate that to this idea that some of the ancient philosophers present themselves as enlightened, be like Pythagoras or Epicurus, whereas the Stoics acknowledging their flaws, that's something that research tells us people are more likely to actually benefit from. They think this guy isn't perfect. Like, he loses his temper sometimes, but I can see that he's figuring out ways of coping with it. So maybe I could do that too. What we want to learn is how you get to the destination. It's not that helpful seeing someone that's already there, unless we see how they got there. What the Stoics show us more of is people on the path. And so it's easier for us to track how they're making headway towards the destination.
Actually, that's so interesting, Donald. So really, like, I never thought about it. Actually, that makes a lot of sense now after you said that. Yeah, thank you.
It's true. We know this in therapy. In fact, one of my area of specialism as a therapist is social anxiety. I worked in the past with lots of different problems, particularly anxiety, but mainly social anxiety, things like public speaking anxiety. And I think most of the clients that I saw who had severe public speaking anxiety were trying really hard to copy public speakers that they admired, like Tony Robbins and people like that. And that was making them worse, because they were not accepting. We know research tells us that people with social anxiety have very high standards that they impose on themselves and on other people. So they kind of set themselves up for failure as a consequence of that. And so then they'll seek out people who seem to be flawless and get frustrated and anxious with themselves because they're not like the person that they aspire to be. And so getting people to accept small mistakes that they make, to be tolerant of feelings of anxiety, tends to be far, far more helpful for them than trying to get them to emulate what they perceive as an image of. And often the images of perfection we get in society are completely bogus anyway. So we see people, maybe giving a speech, but perhaps it's edited.
Yes.
They've done it they've been doing it many times over many years. So it creates a kind of illusion that it's easier than it actually is. We maybe even it's maybe not even a real representation of what happened. They've edited out, like, mistakes they made and things like that. So, yeah, a realistic attitude towards performance is one that's more tolerant of trivial mistakes.
Exactly, Donald. I used to thought that after seeing so many YouTubers, they used to like say fluently and without any stopping. But a YouTuber showed how he records, and
Uh-huh.
exactly that's what it is. Like they edit a lot of stuff. They say something, they will be silent. They will take multiple takes. So it's like all we see is the edited version. Yeah.
It's an odd thing. I've seen people over the years who are experts trying to eliminate any speech errors, so never sort of saying or
Hmm.
But over the years when I've worked with audiences, and like, people often, their favorite speakers tend to just be people who are passionate and knowledgeable about a subject, and it doesn't matter if occasionally they hesitate or they trip over their words. Like, most people are very forgiving about that, as long as what you're saying is entertaining and interesting. And whereas if your speech is completely flawless but what you're saying is boring, then you're probably not going to be of much benefit or interest to people. It's odd. So, my advice to my clients was usually it's more important just to be passionate about what you're saying, and talk about things that are meaningful to you, rather than worrying about, getting your words exactly right.
Yes, it's Donald. Donald, do you have any suggestions for the people who suffer from shyness?
Yeah. Gosh, I could talk for days about shyness, because it's something I've worked with a lot over the years. The bottom line is that we know the most robust technique in the entire field of psychotherapy research, arguably, is exposure therapy. And it has like a 90% success rate for things like a snake phobia, like an animal phobia. It goes down a bit. It's about 75% effective for social anxiety, which is similar to shyness. Um, but basically, and there are many other things that we can do, but basically, you have to somehow get more used to putting yourself in the situations that you avoid. And the key is to do it for longer than normal, to become tolerant of it, and to endure those situations for a bit longer than normal. Because anxiety will spike quickly. And the mistake people often make is to put themselves in a situation where they feel uncomfortable and then to immediately leave it.
Yes.
So you'll be leaving it when your anxiety is at its peak, and that will usually make you worse, or at least it won't benefit you. Whereas if you stay in a situation, your anxiety will reduce. Now, the easiest way to explain that is one of the main correlates of anxiety is that your heart will beat faster. So your heart rate will roughly double if you're experiencing extreme anxiety. And if I say to people, okay, so let's say you've got a phobia, say you've got public speaking anxiety, and you're on a stage in front of 1,000 people, what's going to happen to your heart rate? Well, it's going to go up, right? Um, but if you stay on that stage like long enough, what's going to happen to your heart rate? And they usually pause and have to think about it for a minute, but they go, I guess eventually it's going to go back down, but they're not sure how long that's going to take. It varies, but it can take maybe 15, 20 minutes. Sometimes it could take 30 or 40 minutes. Sometimes it could be less. But yeah, basically your heart rate will go back down. So you need to remain in the situation, ideally long enough for your heart rate to reduce. And if you do that repeatedly, you'll train your body to habituate, to use the technical term, so that your anxiety will wear off. It's a natural form of emotional processing. Even animals exhibit this habituation phenomenon. All animals virtually exhibit this. So it's so basic. It's surprising that people don't understand it. And again, actually, some of the self-help techniques that people use potentially interfere with this natural, basic form of emotional processing. So do public speaking as much as you're able, or at least you can mentally rehearse it, like visualize and your imagination, putting yourself in situations. Now, the trick with social anxiety, and the reason that the success rate is lower, is that if someone has a fear of spiders or snakes or something like that, they're basically triggered by the sight mainly. They could be triggered by other things, like someone saying the word or a certain sound, but primarily they're triggered by seeing a spider, right, or a snake. Social anxiety is not really anxiety that's triggered by seeing people's faces, right? It's actually more complex than that. It's more cognitive, as psychologists often put it. So social anxiety is more the fear of what you think other people might be thinking about you. So it's a little bit more abstract, right? It's not that I'm frightened of your face. I'm frightened about what you might be thinking of me. And so we also call it fear of negative evaluation. So it's mainly anxiety about other people thinking that you're stupid or criticizing you in some way, judging you in some kind of negative way. Now, the trick there is it's hard to expose yourself for prolonged periods to the thought that other people are thinking negative of you. It's more abstract than seeing a snake. Right, so that does make it a little bit trickier. But there are ways that we can do that. We can get people, like when I treated social anxiety in the past, I one of the things we would do, and usually you may need someone's help to do this. We do shame attacking exercises, which you actually find in ancient Stoic and Cynic literature. I mean, what Zeno was doing with the pot of lentil soup was a shame attacking exercise. We get people to tie a bit of string around a banana and walk it like a dog through a shopping mall. Like my favorite was I would get clients to go into a bar or a cafe in London and say, excuse me, everybody. Sorry to interrupt you. I was in here earlier and I left behind a book and I just wondered if anybody had found it. It's called Overcoming Shyness and Social Anxiety. Has anybody found a book lying around called Overcoming Shyness and Social Anxiety? Now, people who suffer from shyness and social anxiety will be like, there's no way I'm doing that. Like, that's like the last thing that I would ever want to do, because by definition, it's publicly drawing attention to the fact that they suffer from shyness and social anxiety. But that's the very thing that they actually would benefit from exposing themselves to repeatedly. So you imagine if you were able to do that, probably with the help of a therapist, enough times. Like, say you did that like 20 times. After a while, it's like whatever. Like the anxiety wears off eventually, right?
Yes.
The other thing that you can do that's a bit more modern and a bit trickier to describe is you can expose yourself to the negative thoughts by visualizing them. So you could say you're frightened that other people are going to think you're an idiot. You could imagine that people are wearing a badge that says Donald is an idiot, or they're wearing a cap like that says Donald is an idiot, or a T-shirt that says Donald is an idiot, letters of it. And so if you just kind of like try and constantly imagine that you see that on people, like the reason that you would have it as a badge or a hat is that one of the factors in overcoming social anxiety, and perhaps even possibly one of the most important factors, is where you focus your attention. So people with social anxiety tend to focus their attention on themselves more.
Yes.
To an unnatural extent. They feel the center of attention, and their attention becomes highly self-focused. And one of the things that benefits social anxiety is for prolonged periods, repeatedly shifting the focus of attention outward onto other people. So again, if you're going to do a technique like this, it helps if you imagine that you can see the words on the other people, because it helps to make sure that your attention is being shifted onto them. But at the same time, you're prolonging your exposure to the idea that they think Donald is an idiot. So after a while, I might think, geez, if everyone had a badge on that said Donald is an idiot, I'd feel kind of bad about that at first. But do you know what? After a while, I'd get used to it, and the effect would wear off, and it would just become kind of boring to me, and then it wouldn't bother me anymore. And then the thought that they might be thinking that doesn't really bother me as much anymore. Now, I might still pay attention to it, but in a kind of matter-of-fact way, right? So I could go, oh, maybe this guy actually does think I'm an idiot. So, I don't know, perhaps I should try and do something about that. But it doesn't make me anxious anymore, right? And so it means I'm more able to problem solve and adapt and respond appropriately. So those are things. Shift your focus outward. Look more at the people that you're talking to. Try to broaden your attention. If you're speaking to an audience, try and pay more attention to the audience as a whole, and don't be as focused on your own internal thoughts and what's going on in your body. Here's a good example of bad coping strategies. So people will sometimes do breathing exercises to try to cope with social anxiety. Now, we know that a possible problem with doing that is that if you're trying to control your breathing, there's two problems it creates. One is, by the way, Jordan Peterson tells people to stand up straight and look people, which is also terrible advice, right? For the simple reason that these are typical strategies that people will tell you they're already doing when they come into therapy, and they think that they're going to help them to suppress or conceal their anxiety, but usually they just magnify it, because they're heightening self-focused attention. Like, so people that try to breathe differently, the two things will happen. One, it means that they're going to be paying far more attention to themselves than would be natural, and that reduces the attention that they're able to allocate to the other person. And then the other thing is that they're trying to walk and chew gum, as I put it. So because you're trying to maybe breathe differently or maybe repeat an affirmation in your head, the risk you have also is you're increasing cognitive load. That can make you feel more awkward because you're kind of trying to breathe differently and trying to talk naturally at the same time. You're doing too many things. And that awkwardness can heighten anxiety as well. So try to be natural, like confront the fears that you have, like head on until you get bored with them, rehearse them in your imagination, write them down on paper, rather than running away from them, and try to keep your attention focused outwardly.
Yes, Donald, I have read the same about that in a book. They also did an experiment where they divided the people into two groups. One group will be focusing on the breathing, and the second group will be continuing the high arousal state. They say that if they are really feeling stressed, they say that, yes, I'm excited, and then they go.
Yeah. There's also one of the things I'd say to people is that, people often, we know that people typically want to eliminate anxiety, but people that don't have a problem with anxiety usually feel some anxiety, but they don't see it as a problem. So,
Yes.
for example, people who are very experienced public speakers who get on a stage, performers like musicians and stuff, feel an adrenaline rush, right? Their heart beats faster, like they feel the adrenaline course. Now, someone else might describe that as anxiety. It's kind of subjective. Whether do you call that anxiety or do you call it an adrenaline rush? Like, and the person who tries to eliminate that feeling might be eliminating something that's actually necessary in that situation in order to be more dynamic and project your voice more and amplify your gestures. Your body is doing what it thinks you need to do in that situation. Like, it's appropriate to produce more energy and adrenaline in order to adapt to speaking to like a really big audience. So you wouldn't want to be really kind of relaxed
Yes.
and low key, and that's it. It would seem weird. Like, there's an interesting study that shows people with social anxiety, if you ask them, how do you think other people perceive you in a social situation when you're feeling anxious? They'll typically say, people perceive me as anxious. Like, they see my hands shaking or they see me sweating and they think I look nervous and anxious and stuff like that, right? That's obviously the core of their fear. Like, they're worried that people are going to see that. But when you replicate a social situation, say you ask them to give a presentation, or to interact with people in a kind of like a role play dinner party or like situation, social situation, and then you ask other people how they perceive them. What we find is that other people do not perceive people with social anxiety as looking anxious. Typically, sometimes they might be. Generally, they don't. They usually perceive them as being unfriendly and aloof. And the reason for that is that people with social anxiety are trying really hard to mask their feelings. And the way they then come across is kind of cold, sort of poker faced. And actually, sometimes I'll be talking to my friends and they'll say, geez, that guy that you introduced me to seemed kind of a bit unfriendly. And I'll say, do you think it might be, though, that he's anxious? Like, because sometimes if people seem a bit withdrawn or kind of cold or unfriendly, it's often because they're socially anxious, you know, and an unfamiliar situation. So we every day all around the world, people are misinterpreting each other's body language, right? It
Yes.
helps to know that.
Yes, Donald. Actually, that may be the case. Some people may project as unfriendly, but actually they are masking their anxiety issues.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Thank you so much. That was enlightening. Thank you. Yeah. So my next question is, Donald. Marcus Aurelius actually imagines nature herself as a physician, like Asclepius, the god of
Yeah,
medicine, prescribing hardships to him as if they were painful remedies. Can you
that's right.
talk about that?
That's an amazing metaphor. Asclepius is the son of Apollo, who's kind of the patron god of philosophy. And he's the god of healing, of the arts, the muses, and also of philosophy. Apollo's the god of disease and the god of healing, but Asclepius, his son, is the god of the art of medicine. That's kind of derivative of this more abstract natural force that Apollo symbolizes. And this idea, like many of, I think Marcus Aurelius is writing about 500 years after the death of, over 500 years after the death of Socrates. And yet, this same metaphor is in Plato's account of Socrates. Socrates said his last words were, "We owe a cock to Asclepius, the god of healing." Famously, we owe a sacrifice to the god of healing, and no one knows exactly what he meant by that. But he seems to have meant that something about his trial and execution, like, was therapeutic to him. He was being somehow healed. It's kind of ambiguous. People have always puzzled over the exact meaning, but Marcus uses that same imagery. He obviously interprets that idea as meaning that anything that fate throws at us, any setback or misfortune, as long as we know how to take it in the right way, it can be beneficial. It's like Nietzsche saying, "What does not kill me can only make me stronger." So Marcus thinks, look, even if you lose your job, either you kind of get frustrated by that and depressed about it, or you try to grow stronger. It's almost like trying to digest food, to digest these misfortunes so that we can actually turn them into something positive. Do you know the irony is, as I get older, I think we read all these books, philosophy and self help, but many of the things we learn, I think, just from observing our own life experience. I feel almost as if there are two types of people in the world. If you'll forgive me for being a little bit superficial, a little bit glib about this, but I think by the time you reach 40, you're old enough that you can now look back on your life and the things that have happened to you more. And some people don't really learn from that, and other people spend more time reviewing their life. So you might think of all the times that you've lent people money, and you might look back on it and think, how many times did they give me it back? Like, how many times was it a good idea or a bad idea to lend things to people? And you could learn that from your own experience, right? And what you learn might be different from what other people tell you or what you read in books, for instance. But one of the main things I think we can learn from looking back and reviewing our own life, strangely, and it's easier to learn this way than from books, is that if you look back at setbacks that you've experienced in life, like you maybe had a partner, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend, and you broke up with them, and it seemed really catastrophic at the time. And then, maybe there were exams that you failed, or maybe there were like businesses or projects that didn't really work out, or job interviews that you didn't really get. And at the time, these things seemed like real setbacks, like catastrophes. But when you look back over the whole narrative, the whole story of your life, most of them usually seem relatively trivial in light of subsequent events. So you broke up with somebody when you were a teenager and it seemed awful at the time, but then you met someone else. And then you had multiple other relationships after that. So the first breakup now seems kind of trivial, and maybe in some ways it was a good thing because it gave you the opportunity to go on and meet other people that maybe you enjoyed being with. You lost a job; it seemed catastrophic at the time, but then you found another job. Like maybe it was a better job, right? So when you look back over the course of your life, it's easier, I think, to see setbacks as opportunities, as leading on to other things. It's also it's easier to see them as temporary with the benefit of hindsight, and it's also easier to see them as potential opportunities in some cases as having led on to better things. This seems glib as well, perhaps, but it's true nevertheless. Many of the clients I saw were people that were in therapy because they'd lost their job or their relationship had ended. And, if there were people who were a little bit older, maybe approaching middle age, and they'd lost a job, often they ended up then becoming self-employed. And for many people, years later, they would tell you it was the best thing that ever happened to them. They maybe had been in the wrong job, or they'd been in a job too long, and losing their job seemed like a big setback, but actually it was the impetus that they needed to go off and become a writer or to become an entrepreneur or do something a bit more creative, that ultimately was maybe really stressful at first, but ultimately became much more rewarding for them.
It's done. But sometimes when the loss is greater, it's hard to accept it for some time. But
I think so. Some losses are difficult to accept, but the majority of setbacks or losses look different to us further in the future. And so one of the techniques that we can use is simply to contemplate what a setback will look like 10 or 20 years in the future when we reflect back on it, or maybe even at the end of our life on our deathbed when we're looking back many years from now on something. And there'll be things that happen, that we'll look back on, and we're never going to think it was a good thing. Like we're always going to look back on it and see it as a loss or a bad thing. But maybe 20 or 30 years from now, it's going to be part of a bigger story, and it'll seem less traumatic or less overwhelming than it does now. And the sneaky thing is, every time you do that, just for a moment, think to yourself, how will I feel about this 20 years from now? You're rehearsing, adopting, or assuming that mindset. And it's not a mindset that avoids the pain. It's usually just a mindset that reframes it slightly or places it within a broader context. So it's speeding up the process of assimilating, digesting painful experiences and moving beyond them by just asking ourselves that simple question. Sometimes we call that time projection in therapy. I like to say there are many things that we do in cognitive therapy. It's complicated. Some of the things we do are very hard to explain, are complicated. But equally, because there's so many things that we do in cognitive therapy, some of the things we do are really easy. I think often when people try to take cognitive behavioural therapy and make it into self-help, they pick the wrong bits. So sometimes they take the bits that are kind of hard to do, and ignore other bits that are pretty easy to do. Time projection is one of the easiest things to do. You just have to say to yourself, how am I going to feel about this 20 years from now? Now, that doesn't help everybody, but 95% of the time, if you're patient and you come back to doing that every few days, you're gradually going to help yourself move forward in life.
Yes, Donald. Many people ask me in the comments that there are so many bad people when compared to us. Then nothing bad happened to them, but why bad is happening to me, even though I'm a good person? How to answer that question?
Well, for a start, we're not good people. We're all bad people, right? We're all greedy. We're all narcissistic. We're all lazy. We all can be cruel. And Marcus Aurelius says this. He says, when you get annoyed with other people, when you think that's not fair, that guy doesn't deserve this, he's bad. Marcus Aurelius says the first thing you should say is maybe you do some of these things yourself, right? I think what he's saying there is very profound. We tend to judge other people more harshly when we ignore the presence of similar flaws in our own character. Like, you know, when you have a strong sense of injustice about bad people, that to me that's a warning sign that we're lacking awareness of our own flaws. And Marcus goes a step further and he says that you might not be doing bad things like they are, but if you look more closely, you still have the potential. Like, you know, in a extreme situation, maybe you would steal or lie in the way that they are. You know, it's easy to think that we're virtuous when we're not under pressure. Like, but if you were starving, like if your business was threatened with bankruptcy, like if your family were in danger, then you know, in those situations, that's when people break and start to lie and steal and deceive and harm other people. And you know, when people are angry and despairing, then they often become vicious towards other people. Like, so it's when we're all relaxed and happy and everything's safe, it's easy to think that we're flawless. Like, but our flaws emerge more when we're placed under pressure, like, and a situation becomes more threatening. That's when your true character emerges, and then we become more like the people that we get upset with. So, I think first of all, it seems less of a black and white dichotomous situation. And it's easier to process if we begin by acknowledging that the we're the bad people. We're all in the same boat. Although we do, you know, we don't all commit the same crimes. We all have similar flaws. I think it's funny that we all now follow politics on the news and in social. So you go on social media. It seems to me it's a constant stream of telling us how greedy celebrities are and how corrupt politicians are. Like all the gossip, you know, that's on social media and stuff. But most of us, if we suddenly became a multimillionaire celebrity, you know, or became very powerful politicians, we'd probably end up doing things where we're morally compromised, and you know, no one is perfect. Like, so I think recognizing that in ourselves helps to be more empathic, um, and realizing also that sometimes people do greedy or vicious things because they're frightened or angry, like, or despairing. I used to work with people that, I guess, when we talk about bad people, I've worked with over the years really bad people. What, you know, I have to kind of qualify and say, well, the sort of people that other people would describe as bad, I just don't really see them that way. Strangely, because I worked with young offenders, I worked with the probation service, right? So I worked with people that had been in prison. I worked with people that had been were young offenders. They'd been in what we call Borstal in Britain. I've worked with people that had committed all sorts of crimes. Um, but usually, as a therapist, you're talking to them about how they got to that point and about what their thoughts and feelings are. And so, from that point of view, it was hard for me to get angry with them or judge them. You know, I wouldn't forgive them for the terrible things that they did to other people, but I could understand why they did them. You know, because maybe if it was young school children, often, for instance, some of the young people I saw, their parents were in prison, or their parents were addicted to drugs like heroin. And so this child has grown up in this horrible toxic environment, and they feel that everyone is out to get them, and they have no future ahead of them. And so they steal and they become selfish and vicious, but it becomes more understandable. It's kind of a result of the way people treat them and role models they had as a child, all these ingredients mixed together. Like, so it becomes harder for me just to view them as inherently evil or vicious people. I see them more as a product of their circumstances, if you like. Um, What the Stoics say as well is something, I guess, very challenging or radical about that. Marcus talks about this in the Meditations. He says that if you think that fortune is rewarding bad people, so like God is unjust or something like that, then you've misunderstood what what's good and bad in life. So if you think that people get promoted ahead of you and they don't deserve it because they're bad people, Marcus would say, but these are just externals. That's not really what constitutes our true good in life. Getting promoted for many people might turn out to be the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Like for me, for a surprising number of people, getting promoted at work is the worst thing that happens. It's a cliche in a way because people try really hard to get earn more money and get promoted, and then often they end up having more stressful jobs, more responsibility, and working longer hours. And the cliche thing is then often that damages their family life, and then they get divorced, and then they think, how did I get in this situation? The cliche is you have to be careful what you wish for, because often people want a goal, but they don't really visualize what it entails, what the consequences might be. I think very often people want goals in terms of their business or their job and don't think about what the impact might be for their social life or their family, and then that leads them into to problems in their marriage in many cases. It takes a lot of effort to have a broad perspective where we see our lives in a more rounded and a more balanced way. But Marcus thinks that we're mistaken about what we think are the good and bad things in life. Money, reputation, promotion, these are superficial goods. They're externals. They're not really intrinsically good. What matters, what's truly good in life, is wisdom, and knowing how to use these things well. That's what turns them into good or bad things. And the irony, he says, is that even poverty or sickness or isolation, which most people see as bad things, could the wise man or woman who knows how to use externals well might actually benefit from those things, because what matters is the way that they use their experiences rather than the experiences themselves.
Obstacle is the way.
Yeah, the obstacle is the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Donald. Donald, can you explain Fantasia cataleptica? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a technical Greek term that means it's hard to translate into English, but it means a grasping impression, as in grabbing something with your hand. In the Stoics, sometimes a rough English translation of this would be objective representation, or a representation that grasps the facts of the situation objectively. It's as opposed to what wouldn't be Fantasia cataleptica would be sophistry and rhetoric, and most of the things that clients say when they come into therapy would not be Fantasia cataleptic. So, like when somebody, I'll give you a good example about public speaking. So I'm talking to somebody who in London, I used to have a clinic in Harley Street, let's say, and I see a lot of businessmen. They come in and say things like, I gave a presentation and it was a complete disaster. I made a complete mess, a dog's breakfast of it, and the audience just tore a strip off me and shot me down in flames, right? And I'd be like, wow, that sounds awful. Like my eyes would be widening, right? Like they'd be like, oh, just shut in. They're almost in tears, like reliving it, right? It's traumatic. I had this traumatic experience at work, right? Now, but they've used all this highly emotive language. They shot me down in flames. They've used these metaphors. It's like poetry that's designed to evoke strong emotions, but they're using that on themselves, right? And so this is not an objective description of the facts. It's like a song about how awful. Like they're singing the song of catastrophe, like the siren song. It's like it's like a poem that they've written about how catastrophic. And if I say, could you tell me exactly what happened, but get rid of any value judgments at all, like any kind of emotive language, just kind of like describe the bare facts. And they might say, well, I gave a presentation and I made a mistake, and then someone said that they disagreed with something that I said. And that might be it. Right. And I think, well, that doesn't sound as bad, really. Like, that's Fantasia Cataleptica.
Yeah.
Right. So you've just described it in a way that has a firm grip on reality, because it's not clouded by all of these value judgments and all of the rhetoric. And it's hard. For some reason, it's hard to do that. And in a way, when we talk about the big conflict between the sophists and the philosophers, was that the sophists used rhetoric, they used manipulative language to influence audiences. But we're all sophists, and we use sophistry on ourselves every day. Like, you have to learn to kill the sophist in our head. Like, we have to at least see through it, our own brainwashing, and realize that we are constantly misrepresenting events to ourselves. We're constantly freaking ourselves out unnecessarily, and it takes an effort to step back and describe things in a more impartial, objective way. One of the things the Stoics point out is that often, if we're describing misfortunes that affect other people, we'll often, not always, but in many cases, we'll describe it in a more matter-of-fact way. Like, oh, that guy lost his job and he's really upset about it, but I'm sure he'll get over it. Like, we kind of view it like,
Yes.
but when it happens to us, it's different. Like, it seems like the end of the world, and it's like, so the Stoics think it's odd that when we're talking about how someone else got their wallet stolen, and you're like, yeah, that sucks, but it happens all the time, and things
Yeah.
but if it happens to me, it's like, oh my god, I can't believe this has happened.
Exactly.
So the Stoics think this is a double standard, and when it happens to us, we should learn to view it in a more matter-of-fact, logical way, like we would when we see it happening to other people.
Yes, Donald. Yeah. And like, we can also say this, right? Like, some people, when they are trying to lose weight, they'll say that they tried everything in the world and nothing ever is working for them anymore. And like,
people like to say that. Often one of the simplest rhetorical strategies is exaggeration. And typically clients, particularly depressed clients, but everybody to some extent, like anxious clients as well, we all to some extent will tend to use sweeping generalizations in a way that's unhelpful. It traps us. So clients, actually depressed clients, very typically will say, I've tried everything and nothing works. Like, sometimes I used to write things like that on like Post-it notes and then hide them under the cushion in the chair. And then when my client said it, I'd say, hang on a minute, could you just reach under the and so they'd be like, what? And I'd be like, reach under the cushion, and they'd be like, why? And they go, there's like a bit of paper, and they get this bit of paper out, and they go, it says, I've tried everything and nothing works. And they'd be like, oh right, I just said that. And I'm like, yeah, everyone says that. When they come into
common
therapy,
humanity.
like, really? It's virtually every client says that at the beginning of therapy. And then the client will be like, well, they're talking rubbish, you can't have tried everything, but you just said it. So and when they realize, when they normalize it, and they think, well, everyone tends to say it, it's a pretty common thing. It allows us to kind of take a step back from it and think, is this just rhetoric though that we're using on ourselves? Have you literally tried everything, and did it literally not work at all? Like, usually when people try everything and nothing works, it's because they haven't tried the right things. And very often, a lot of things they've tried, they haven't really tried properly. So they've not persisted in them long enough. They gave up prematurely. They did it in a kind of half-hearted way. So what matters is how you try things, and what effort you put into them as well. But these generalizations are maybe one of the most common types of rhetoric that we use on ourselves. And many of the problems that people experience are due to them making overgeneralizations in their thinking.
Yes, Donald. Yeah. So, Donald, can you tell us about the Pythagoras golden verses? What is it like? What is it about?
Yeah, the golden verses of Pythagoras. So Pythagoras is a strange guy. He's almost a semi-mythological character. He's a sort of legendary philosopher. He's a pre-Socratic. He was much more mystical than Socrates, for example. He influenced generations and generations of later philosophers. He was associated with the cult of Apollo that I mentioned earlier. By some accounts, he claimed to be the son of Apollo or an incarnation of Apollo. His name, Pythagoras, possibly means speaks like the Pythia in Greek, and the Pythia is the female priestess of Apollo. Three different ancient sources tell us that he learned his ethical philosophy from one of the priestesses, one of the Pythias at the temple of Apollo. So this is interesting because in Greek philosophy, people sometimes say there aren't many women in Greek philosophy. But here's an example of one of the very earliest philosophers that influenced, almost everything else, allegedly having derived his philosophy from a woman, from one of the most important women in Greek society. And Pythagoras' followers kept a vow of silence. It was almost a kind of semi-monastic community, and very therapeutic. They used music for healing. They were vegetarians. They believed in reincarnation, like stuff that we would probably associate. Westerners often associate more with
Yes. Eastern.
Eastern
Yeah.
religions, but they believed in reincarnation and stuff like. And the golden verses were written. We don't know for sure when they were written, but we believe they were probably written later. It's hard to say. They could go all the way back to Pythagoras, but scholars think they were probably written by some Pythagoreans much later. And the Stoics seem to have loved Pythagoreanism. They took inspiration from it. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, wrote a number of lost books. One of them is called On Pythagorean Questions. So he wrote a book about Pythagoreanism, and maybe it mentions the golden verses in that book. But certainly Epictetus, and Seneca, and Galen, Marcus Aurelius's physician, all quote the golden verses, if I remember rightly. And not only do they quote it, they seem to use it. It contains self-help advice. There's a lot of stuff in it, but it contains, for example, the advice that every morning you should prepare for the day ahead, and then every evening before your eyes have closed, you should 3 times mentally rehearse the events of the preceding day. And the Stoics seem to have thought that was really useful self-improvement advice. And Galen actually says, who's not a Stoic, but he's an eclectic thinker who's kind of influenced by the Stoics. Galen says that he read the golden verses to himself twice a day. He just thought actually reading this scripture was a kind of therapeutic exercise in itself. Cicero, who was also influenced by Stoicism, but he's actually a follower of the academic school. But he's, arguably the most famous orator in history. He's a Roman statesman in the Roman Republic. And Cicero was, a lot of ancient thinkers were interested in how we improve our memory. And Cicero wrote about memory techniques. But from what I remember, he thought this technique of reviewing your day 3 times also was a technique. It's a technique for self-improvement. It's also a technique actually for enhancing your memory, they thought. And obviously it allows you to engage in what we call a learning cycle now. You can review setbacks that you experienced and think to yourself about what you could do differently next time. So out of all the ancient texts, sometimes people say, what books should I read, is a common question these days.
Yes.
And I tend to think short ones, right? Because there are a lot of really long books out. And the truth is that most people these days are unlikely to sit down and read Heidegger's Being and Time or something like that, because it's hard work to get through it, right? But Plato's Apology, I think, is one of the most profound texts in the Western canon, and it's a masterpiece. You could read it in like 2 hours or something. The handbook or Enchiridion of Epictetus you could read in a couple of hours as well. And the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, I've seen in Greek restaurants, they have it printed out hanging on the wall. Like you could read it in 20 or 30 minutes. So there's no excuse for not reading. Like,
Yeah.
it would be time well spent. Like the amount of time it would take you to watch half a dozen cat videos on YouTube. Right, you could just go and read the Golden Verses of Pythagoras. It's one of the most inspiring spiritual texts of all time.
Thank you, Donald, for the recommendation. Donald, I'm curious, what is your morning ritual?
What is my morning ritual? It varies a lot. I tend to do different things. There was a time when I would get up every morning and I would plan my whole day. I still do that sometimes. I'd get up and in in modern cognitive therapy for depression, we use a planner called activity scheduling. So we'll have like a diary, but instead of breaking it down day by day, I think Stephen Covey also recommends doing something similar. We break each day down into 1 hour segments. Actually, I would usually break my day into half-hour segments. And then I figure out roughly what I'm planning to do in each half-hour segment. And then I have two columns. In one column, I write roughly what I'm planning to do, and then in the other column, I write down what I actually did. Now, I'm not following that routine at the moment, but in the past, that's a common routine that I followed every day when I was doing things very systematically. And usually, what I found is what I ended up doing like bore a little resemblance to what I thought I was going to be doing. Like I learned that answering emails takes way longer than I usually think it's going to take. And my kind of perception of time was like way off. And I noticed that I often thought certain things I could accomplish a lot. I thought I was going to accomplish a lot more, and I wasn't giving myself enough time. And other things were wasting a lot more of my time than I realized. So that was one of the things that I did to try and organize my use of time in my daily routine. Recently, what I've actually tended to do more is contemplate my own mortality. So in the mornings when I wake up, I don't plan my daily routine as much at the moment because my daily routine now is kind of is straightforward. I'm just working on a book, so I just sit and write all day, pretty much, and do the occasional interview like this one. But I'll tend to wake up in the morning and think more about my own mortality, and I try and imagine being on my deathbed and how I would view my life from that perspective. And as I get older, I feel like that becomes more of an important self-improvement technique to me. I think, very simply, that we're born into the world kind of like a blank slate. We're babies. We look around us and think, geez, how does this all work? And we look at the adults and we think, I guess I better follow what they're doing. They seem to know. We're born gullible, right? We have to be gullible to survive. We've got to emulate, to what the adults are doing. So, of course, we pick up a lot of bad habits as children. We pick up, of course, the prevailing values of our society, which often seem to be consumerist, hedonistic, materialistic, egotistical, narcissistic, into celebrity culture. That's what we're surrounded by. And, we pick all that up. We're kind of hypnotized by it, or brainwashed by it. How do we ever get out of that? How do we ever see through all the smoke and mirrors? And I think the Stoics noticed, and many people have noticed, that when people have a brush with death, sometimes it does nothing and they just go back to what they were doing before. But everyone knows that a lot of people say, geez, I nearly died there. And then they think, do you know what? Maybe I'm going to quit my job and become a writer, or maybe I'm going to spend more time with my family, or maybe, and their priorities sometimes change when they have a brush with death. Or sometimes when we lose a loved one, like if we're bereaved, sometimes that can have a similar effect as well. It can make us, it's almost like it snaps us out of a trance. Like, and, so we come into the world bombarded with all this brainwashing. Like, most of the stuff that we get from other people is this kind of bogus philosophy of life. It's all about success, and it's about impressing other people, and it's about having like as much big a pile of money as you can, and then you die, and the big pile of money's still there. Like you didn't even spend it, like, or you spend it on stuff that you didn't really want, like, and we get this philosophy of life that everyone knows is kind of bogus and kind of stupid and superficial, and it takes a shock sometimes to kind of like snap us out of the trance and wake us up from the sleepwalking that we're in otherwise. It takes a brush with death, or sometimes the loss of a loved one, to potentially snap us out of the trance, the bewitchment of our intelligence by the prevailing values of our society, I think. And the Stoics knew that. That's why they say, well, maybe we should be contemplating death more frequently.
Memento
Maybe,
mori.
in a small way, yeah, memento mori, that helps to, that's like a remedy or an antidote for all the inevitable brainwashing that goes on in society.
Donald, but I have doubt. Using such kind of references occasionally could boost us to live more. But if we keep on contemplating on the death, wouldn't be like we will be fearing, right? Like we will be afraid of. Like we should look forward to the future, but like when we are contemplating the death, like it's like full stop. Like so, I have the question.
You sound like Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, because he said the wise man contemplates nothing less than he says he doesn't, the wise man doesn't contemplate his own death, and he focuses instead on life. And so he says the opposite of the Stoics. But I think the thing about, we mentioned earlier about how anxiety naturally tends to wear off, and I think if we contemplate our own death, at first it's kind of depressing or it's scary. But if we just get used to the exercise of doing it, then after a while we get quite matter of fact about it, and it doesn't seem overwhelming anymore. It takes time. It takes time to do that, but then the anxiety will wear off. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we don't care whether we live that. Like, we still don't want to die, but we don't have nightmares, and we don't have death anxiety anymore. Like, when I was a young guy, I had quite severe death anxiety. I'd have nightmares about dying, and I was kind of terrified. I was confused. I didn't understand. I couldn't imagine what happens after you die. It worried me. I spent a lot of time thinking about religion and about my own mortality. And then I kind of got more into philosophy, and I started to kind of spend more time visualizing my own death. And I guess I had a couple of brushes with death, and I had some bereavement in my life. And slowly over the years, I got more used to it. I thought, yep, I'm definitely going to die one day. Like, I'm kind of used to that. I'm used to saying that, and I'm used to kind of accepting it. And I still don't know what happens after you die. Like, and I still feel like I'd like to know, but it doesn't cause me great anxiety. No, it doesn't really make me depressed. I can be more kind of just matter of fact about it, and that allows me to take account of it more in the way that I judge my values and priorities in life. It allows me to think more, is it worth trying to become a really successful author, or to make lots of money or whatever, if it's possible that I could drop dead tomorrow? Should I maybe be focusing more on just trying to live in accord with my values each day, for instance, try to live more with integrity and compassion and creativity and things like that, moment to moment. That's what seems to me to make more sense if I accept the fact that I could drop dead at any minute. These kind of intrinsic values in life become more important than the external values. So I find it liberating. And I completely agree with Seneca, who said to learn how to die is to unlearn how to be a slave. Like, what he meant by that is when we understand that we are mortal, and we're able to then live like mortal creatures, and it shifts our priorities and our values, and it's potentially the most liberating thing that we can experience.
Yes. Now, when you put it that way, it's like really liberating, Donald. Thank you. It's like,
And
yeah, please.
it's just, I think of it just as viewing life in a very realistic way, in a very honest way, like being brutally honest about our lives. But I think it also gets easier as you get older. Not for everybody, but for most people. I find that some of the young people I've spoken to find it quite hard because it's quite an alien idea. But once you're older, you lose more people over time, and you have more brushes with death. And then, a lot of once people are like 60, 70, 80 years old, death is a pretty familiar concept to them. When they get old, they think this might be it. Like, your chances of dying feel like they increase as you get older, and you have health problems. When you're young and you have a health problem, you think, I'll get over this. It's not going to kill me. But when you're 90 and you get a fever or something, or you have some health problem, you think maybe this is it. Like, so as time goes on, not for everybody, but I think for most people, death becomes more a fact of life. And so they become kind of more inoculated against death anxiety, inevitably. But the Stoics, in a way, the Stoics want us to speed up that natural emotional processing just by using our intellect, using our mind again to project ourselves into the future. And we is in a way just speeding up our natural process of emotional evolution through life.
Yes, Jonah. Recently, my father has passed away, and like my father, like he's very young, and he wanted to do a lot of things, but he got buried in the work, always work, work, and suddenly out of nowhere, like it happened in 1 week. So that was like shock to me. Like I understood. Yeah, am I doing everything correctly? Am I enjoying life? Yeah.
I think one of the things that influenced me was my father passed away when I was about 14, 15 years old. And my father died very slowly. He had lung cancer, and he died over the space of about a year. And I felt that towards the end of his life, he spent a lot of time looking back on and reviewing his life and feeling that he was unsatisfied with how he'd spent his life. That's how it came across to me as a teenager. And that had a big impact on me. Like, as a kid, I walked away from it and I thought, I don't want to be like that. I thought, I don't want to get to the end of my life and look back on it and think I did it wrong. Like, I wasted my life, or, I'm not really happy. I wish I could go back and do it again. Because you don't get like a redo, on life. You
Respawn.
only get one shot at it. Like, that's why it's helpful to project yourself into the future, and then think, actually, hang on a minute, maybe I need to change this because I'm not going to get a second chance at it. I don't want to get to the end of it and think I did it all wrong. Like, I went down, I went left when I should have went right. So I think but loss is a terrible thing, and we're never going to look back on it and think it was a good thing. It's always going to be a bad thing. But definitely we can learn from it, and it can actually, although it's a painful experience, all painful experiences, like we were talking about earlier, can also contribute to our resilience. You could even say there's a therapeutic aspect to it, or a strengthening aspect, maybe would be a better way to
Yes.
phrase it.
Yes.
We like Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill me can only make me stronger. Through loss of loved ones and setbacks that we have in life, if we can digest the experience naturally in a healthy way, if we've got the wisdom to kind of see it from another perspective, it can make us, I feel like it enlarges our soul, and makes us more rounded and stronger, wiser individuals. It's part of the tapestry of life, to endure these things. And people who have never experienced any loss are kind of often pretty boring, superficial people, you know, like the most interesting people you meet in your life are often the people that have had the toughest lives. People used to ask me, who are your role models in life? And they want me to say Nelson Mandela or like,
Yes.
you know, David Beckham or so, I don't know, like the sort of people that, Steve Jobs or something, you know. And that always seems really odd to me because I thought, I don't know any of these people personally. It would seem really weird to say that they're a role model. The people that I've met in life that had the biggest effect on me, if I'm being really honest about it, were recovering alcoholics and drug addicts that I met, because these are people who have hit rock bottom, and then in some cases they managed to kind of claw their way back from it, and they seemed more real to me and more inspiring than, like, you know, successful businessmen and celebrities and sports personalities and stuff like that. I could see how they'd wrestled with anger and depression and anxiety, and and how they gradually kind of overcome problems. And so people who have lost everything, like, or I feel are often the wisest, the most enlightened, the most interesting, you know, people that I've met over the course of my life. The ones who have come out the other side and managed to survive and to cope with it. And people who have never lost anything and have always had everything are often kind of boring and superficial and don't have that much to share. Like, I feel.
Yes, Donald. I totally agree with that. And Donald, I just want to share this. I want to be the greatest person ever. So, but whenever I read about the greatest persons that are alive on the earth, they are the one who faced rock bottom or faced the hardest of the difficulties ever. But I used to have a fear that if am aspiring for that, such kind of things will happen to me. But it happened. But I slowly started to accept it.
Things happen inevitably in life. I think also, if you take risks in life, and by risks it could be physically doing, you know, pushing yourself. It could be traveling to different places. It could be engaging in different projects, but also it could be making friendships and forming relationships. We make ourselves vulnerable to loss. How do you make yourself vulnerable to loss? You make friends with people. Like, if you didn't have any friends, you'd never lose anybody. Like, if you didn't have any loved ones, you know, like Shakespeare says, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, right? So somebody who's got like loads of friends makes themselves super vulnerable to loss. There's more people that they care about that they could lose. Um, but that's what life is all about. You know, it's about putting yourself out there and doing things, and, you know, having friendships, and, you know, seeking out adventure and creating new things. You know, life in a sense is about taking risks. Um, and, you know, when you do that, inevitably, more and more you'll experience setbacks and losses. Um, and if you're not broken by them, like, then you potentially become wiser and stronger as a consequence.
Thank you, Donald. Donald, how to process grief?
Mm. I think the key to processing grief is to accept it. The mistake that people make, I think, is the biggest mistake people make is to try and suppress grief or avoid it, or to do other things that kind of interfere with it too much. So using drugs or alcohol to suppress grief, or just blocking it out from your mind or being in denial of it, it's a natural experience. And so we should accept feelings of grief. But there's a trick to accepting feelings without allowing ourselves to be overwhelmed by them. And that comes from not suppressing or avoiding a feeling, but viewing it from a wider perspective. So, like, becoming bigger than the grief. And how we do that is by looking at it from different angles, by asking ourselves, how would other people, or how have other people uh, coped with grief like this in the past? How do I imagine that the type of people that I admire might cope with this? How do people that I know or people that I've read about or heard about, how do they cope with it differently from the way that I cope with it? And again, how will I view this 10, 20, 30 years from now? How do I see this from a broader perspective, like from the view from above? If I think of this not just in terms of what happened yesterday or the day before, but in terms of the part it plays in the whole narrative of my entire life, like how do I view it within that bigger story considered as a whole? And these are just ways of almost like you're looking at something in a museum, like an exhibit, like a painting, or a work of art. It's like, think of it more like you're just walking around and looking at it from different angles. And maybe then you go and you look at it with a group of other people, or maybe you go away and you come back and you look at it on a different day or with different light. So you're not kind of like a block trying to run away from it or avoid it, or you're not just like sitting kind of glaring at it obsessively, ruminating about it from the same perspective, but you're just casually learning to look at it from a few different perspectives. I think that moving around something, casually allowing yourself to experience it from a broader perspective, from a more future perspective, from a group perspective, like helps the natural and emotional processing. If we do it in a casual and a kind of natural way, these are all things that some people will just do instinctively. Like it's just part of normal conversation we might have as well when we talk about our grief with other people. Like, these perspectives come up. So allowing ourselves to explore multiple perspectives, it increases what we call cognitive flexibility, like technically, and we know that can be useful as a way of experiencing and processing difficult feelings. So being patient with ourselves, accepting the feelings, viewing them from different perspectives.
Thank you, Donald. My camera broke down, so let's continue the questions in this way. Can you explain the concept of prosoki or prosoki?
Yeah. It's a cool word because in Greece, if you're just walking around, you see this word everywhere. It's written on street signs. So like it means pay attention or beware. And so if you have like a sign that's beware of the dog, it'll have like a picture of a dog and it'll say prosoki in Greek underneath it, right? Or if you're on the metro or the underground, it'll kind of like say prosoki for mind the gap, or like, for instance, and things like that. So it means pay attention in Greek. Epictetus has a whole discourse called On Prosoke. So it seems clear that it was a technical concept, or at least a quasi-technical concept in Stoicism, and in early Christianity it also became kind of like a technical concept. And it's very tempting just to translate it as mindfulness, because Epictetus means pay attention to your mind. And specifically, he means pay attention to a part of your mind that the Stoics call proheresis. And that means your value judgments, basically. The decisions you make about what you desire, what you fear, like the value that you place on things, the way that your values influence your emotions and your behavior. Like the Stoics think that we should pay attention to that. And they're pretty clear that they think we need to pay attention to it continuously. Because I think it's Musonius Rufus that says, and Epictetus says similar things. Musonius Rufus was his teacher, that if you allow your attention to wander from your value judgments for a few moments, then you potentially just lapse into patterns of thinking it could take you a long time to get back out of again. So you potentially you have to always be monitoring these value judgments. So this is in a way the core of Stoicism, is this kind of mindfulness, continual mindfulness of the difference. I think Now, Buddhist mindfulness is a bit of a vague concept, and people interpret it in different ways. The Stoics never refer to mindfulness of breathing, for instance, or
Yes.
mindfulness of walking. And some Stoics would say, well, what mindfulness really means in Buddhism is mindfulness of the mind. But the Stoics are very, I guess, more emphatic about that, perhaps, that it's a constant attention to how you use your judgments. The central psychological doctrine of Epictetus is it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them.
Yes.
And you could say that Prosoke is constantly bearing that idea in mind and noticing that it's our opinions that are upsetting us rather than external events. It's a constant cognitive distancing in a way, constantly avoiding allowing ourselves to fuse our value judgments with reality. I'll tell you another cool way to explain it. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, said he explained what we call cognitive distancing as follows. He said, imagine you're wearing coloured glasses, but like they're rose tinted or they're dark blue and depressive. But what if you've been wearing them for like years and you've never taken them off, and then you start to think,
That's the reality.
you know, that's the way everything looks, right? Everything's just blue. You've forgotten how things look without the glasses. And Prosoke would be constantly reminding yourself that you're wearing blue glasses, like, and not forgetting, constantly being aware that you're looking through coloured lenses and not allowing yourself to forget that and just assume that the things you're looking at are actually blue. So we look at things through catastrophic coloured glasses a lot of the time. The Stoics would say just realizing that that's what you're doing. That when you say this is awful, the awfulness isn't a natural property. It doesn't exist in atoms in nature. Like it's awfulness is more an expression of how we're responding to situation. Like it's more like an exclamation. Like it's something that we bring. Like not something that a quality that inherently exists in nature. That's how I would describe Prosoke. I think it's obviously we would compare it to the idea, at least the way that mindfulness is interpreted in modern uh, Buddhism and modern cognitive behavioral therapy places a lot of emphasis on mindfulness as well.
Thanks, Donald. Donald, a friend asked me this question. It's like weird to ask, but many people say to let it go, right? Like let go of thoughts. So the question
Mm-hmm.
is it about not thinking at all about the thoughts or just not caring about the thoughts? If it is about not thinking at all, then we cannot focus on anything, right? It is if it is about not caring about negative thoughts, then how to know which is a helpful thought? So it's a complicated question.
So we can't eliminate all of our thoughts. That
Yes.
would be impossible. I mean, let's start here, okay? Let's start with the distinction between two different types of thought. Usually, whenever something's confusing, like here's a tip from philosophy, if you like. If something's confusing, often it's a good idea to start off by separating it into two columns. Like maybe there's two things we're talking about here, right? So maybe there's two different types of thoughts we're talking about, right? So perhaps there are automatic thoughts that just occur spontaneously, like you suddenly remember something that you're meant to do, like that just popped into your head, right? Or I say something and it reminds you of something else. Well, you didn't sit down and plan to think about that. It was triggered by something you saw or something that someone else said or a tune you heard on the radio, right? So these are what we call spontaneous, or we call them automatic thoughts in psychology. And then there are voluntary thoughts, which we call sometimes strategic thinking. So voluntary thoughts are more like a sequence, like when you're planning something, one thought follows logically on from the next, and they're slower and they're more conscious. Um, you cannot eliminate automatic thoughts. Like it would be impossible to do that. Um, in fact, sometimes the more you try to do so, the more you actually trigger
Yes.
more automatic thoughts. So the other part of the question is, could you just like not care about them? I think maybe I don't know if this answers it or not, but maybe this answers what your friend was asking. Automatic thoughts we should view with indifference, largely with indifference. They're just like something coming on the radio. Like it's no different, really. It's just my brain and my body, or it could be even external events that have triggered them. It's just like the weather, you know. Um, they're thoughts that we receive, like they happen to us. What matters is how we then respond to them. Now, the voluntary thoughts that we have in response could be good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. So I might think, what if you might be talking about death, and I might suddenly think, geez, what if I drop dead tomorrow? Like that thought might just pop into my mind when we're talking. Now, I can't unthink that. Like it's too late. Right? It's an automatic thought, and there's no point getting upset about it. So my response might be to go, oh my god, what if I do die tomorrow? What will I do? That'd be terrible. And I might worry about it and ruminate about it in an unhelpful way. Or, like we were saying earlier, I might voluntarily say, well, how do other people come to terms with their own mortality? How do I imagine the people I admire who are towards the end of their life have managed to come to terms with it? How have people who have written about this come to terms with it? So there might be a kind of more constructive way for me to voluntarily think about it. And then there might be a kind of pathological, like obsessive, like way of thinking about it that I'd want to avoid. So these voluntary trains of thought, I could distinguish helpful and unhelpful. And I might want to make sure that I eliminate the unhelpful one and replace it with a helpful one. But these are voluntary thought process. They take place over time. The key thing is there's like a series of connected thoughts, and the one clue that I have control over that is because it's like a series of connected thoughts. I could interrupt it like at any point. I could change the direction that train of thought is taking. Automatic thoughts tend to be kind of self-contained, if you like. I just suddenly think, geez, what if I drop dead tomorrow? Like it's not like a series, it's like a logical argument. Like it's just like an image or memory or like and so I can't interrupt that. Like I can't change the direction it's taking. It's just happened. It's too late to do it about it. I need to accept that with indifference and think it's just a thing. It's an idea that came into my head. But the voluntary response that I have to it, I can choose. And I might want to distinguish between a helpful and an unhelpful way of responding.
Then does that mean that we have to interact with every single negative thought?
No. Like you have many thousands of thoughts every day. Like loads. I mean, have you ever stopped to count them? Like, there's too many. Like, hundreds of thousands. You probably don't barely notice a lot of them. A lot of them, I bet, you have things that pop through your mind, and 30 seconds later, you've probably forgotten all about them. Like, because they're just random, You stop to think about it. I mean, most of the stuff that goes through our minds is garbage. Like, it really is. It's just random. You'll be watching TV or you walk along the street and you'll see something in a shop window or a billboard, or you think about it for a second and then you'll forget all about it. Like it's just kind of background noise, like stuff that's coming on the radio. Most of our thoughts we don't interact with. It's pathological to try to interact with all your negative thoughts. People with obsessive compulsive disorder, for instance, do that. It potentially you make yourself sick if you try really hard to suppress all your negative thoughts. So the normal response to negative thoughts is just to kind of do nothing in response to them, basically, to kind of shrug them off. So you might be standing on a platform at a train station, and there's an old lady standing beside you, right? And you might suddenly think, I could just give her a kick. To go under that train, and then you might think, geez, why did I think that? It just pops in my head for no reason, a terrible thing. And then you just shrug it off, right? But someone with OCD would think, oh my God, why am I thinking that? What sort of monster am I have to stop myself from ever thinking that again. And they torture themselves, like trying really hard to suppress that thought. But that'll make them sick. That'll make them worse. Whereas another person might go, that was kind of weird, and then they'll just kind of ignore it and think, I wonder what I'm going to have for lunch today. Like they don't really have any response to it. A good way of understanding that is when you're lying in bed at night, you're in a radically different psychological state in a way. Just partly because you turned the lights off and you're lying down, you've closed your eyes, right? Those things alone put your brain in a functionally different state. And people with OCD and generalized anxiety disorder and things like that sometimes have problems falling asleep because they'll be lying in bed at night and they'll think, what if this happens? What if that happens? And then they'll start to struggle and fight against their thoughts. Whereas most people, when they're lying in bed at night and they think, what if I drop dead tomorrow? Or, oh man, I've just got a great idea for a novel. Like, their conscious voluntary thinking will go, yeah, but I'm trying to get to sleep. So whatever, I'll think about that tomorrow. Like, is the normal way to respond, right? And people who don't respond like that are like, I have to think about this right now, have incipient insomnia. Like, they'll keep themselves awake for hours, right? So when you're going to bed, it's more obvious that you have a lot of intrusive automatic thoughts, and a natural way to respond is just to go, whatever, I'll come back to that later. Like, it seems almost strange to say, it's so banal, but that's how we normally respond. And so therefore that's the healthy baseline response to intrusive thoughts is just to go, whatever, I'll think of this later. Basically, that's different from thinking, oh my God, that's awful, I mustn't think about it. Because putting that much value on it actually will make those thoughts more likely to recur and will amplify them. And in fact, in any situation, pretty much, that requires prolonged concentration, you probably also have to do the same thing. So I don't know, like say you were playing chess or you were about to stand up and give a speech and you thought, shit, what if I drop dead tomorrow? Or you thought, maybe my parents never really loved me, or something like, just randomly pops in your head, or you just kind of like think, oh man, I forgot to get food for dinner tonight. Like, normally you think, hang on, but I'm busy, right? I'm in the middle of playing chess, or I'm like literally getting on a stage. I can't think about this just now. And so it's in any situation, or a good one would be if you have children, right? And your kids need, your attention. One of them's about to walk out in the middle of a road or something like that, and you think, oh geez, I haven't got the shot. And you have to think, I'll come back to it later. There's other stuff right now that I need to pay attention to. So it's normal and healthy to set aside intrusive thoughts in many situations where your attention is required by another task. But some people find that difficult to do because their thoughts are very sticky, right? And they want to kind of struggle with them. And usually that's because they're frightened of intrusive thoughts or they place too much value on them. So we do have to get back to this almost Zen-like skill of learning to do nothing and feel indifference towards like 99% of our automatic thoughts. A long time ago, I went to a conference and I attended a workshop on CBT by one of my heroes, I guess, like a psychologist that I really look up to called Adrian Wells, who's a pioneer of cognitive therapy in the UK, and he developed a form of cognitive therapy that's research-based and cutting edge called metacognitive therapy. And he was talking to a room full of clinical psychologists and cognitive therapists, and he said, what you need to teach your clients to do in response to intrusive thoughts is to do nothing. And the therapists were like, but I don't understand. And he said, therapists find this really hard to understand, right? They say it's impossible to do nothing in response to an intrusive thought. They said, but most people do nothing most of the time in response to their intrusive thoughts. And, most clients can understand this. And it sounds too simple to be true. But basically, that is what we need to get back to in most cases, is this, because that would be the natural You have a zillion thoughts a day. You can't respond to most of them. So it's natural to do nothing, and that doesn't mean trying to ignore them or trying to suppress them. It literally means just moving on to the next thing.
Thank you so much, Jonah. And last question: would you like to issue a 7-day challenge to our subscribers? You did one last time, but
A 7-day challenge. What's like they've got to do something or to achieve something over 7 days?
yeah, you can literally throw them a challenge, ask them to do something or be something.
I,
Anything.
all right. Well, I mentioned this earlier, so I'm going to come back to it. I challenged them to read
Yes.
Plato's Apology over the next 7 days and to identify what they believe to be the pros and the cons of Socrates' attitude towards his own impending death.
Oh, that's a very interesting one. Thank you, Donald. Donald, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough because this is one of my
It's been fun.
longest interviews.
Uh,
And the reason why I'm saying is that even though I'm asking you these many questions, I still have like so many questions left. But I think this is a good point to wrap up. But really, you are awesome and you have unparalleled wisdom that helps people. Thank you so much.
well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the questions that you asked me.
Thank you.
Can you subscribe to BNS Goku Great?